Okay, well, good morning. It's going to be a fantastic day, and I'm really pleased to be here with Steve, and also really pleased to be asked by Arthur Rank. Can you still hear okay? Yeah. And what are you going to do if you can't hear? Okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a little bit about NDEs, and you'll see why. And then I'm going to talk about how we die. And one or two of you will have heard this lecture before in Leicester. But you were certainly in Leicester. What was the word you had to remember? Oh, well, just as well you've come for a refresher. The word is curious. Curious. That's what you've got to be. So let's start off with this question. There's no answer to it, but Steve will have one set of answers. I'll point in sometimes in the same direction as Steve, sometimes not. So are mind and brain the same? Are they? Can near-death experiences where the subject feels he has died help? And you'll see why these come together at the end. And this is the mind-body problem. So let's ask the question, what is a mind? Well, everybody has their own definitions. A mind is the subjective feeling that we are who we are. The mind can do, feel, think, play games and have fun. It is consciousness. Okay? The mind comes into a body. Perhaps the mind is nothing but the mechanism of the body. It is made in the brain. So now we have the two theories. The first, the mind is constructed by the brain, all and only brain function. And that's the brain identity theory. Now, it'd be interesting to see in this audience how many of you take that view strongly. You put your hands up. Wow. Mind is made in the brain. It's only a brain function. Oh, enlightened. The other one is that the mind exists only in consciousness and is more than just brain. Do you all subscribe to that? Yeah. It is our subjective experience of the world and our sense of I. Okay. So here's the first theory. You have consciousness first, and then there's a little miracle, and matter arises. Or you can have this one, which is theory 2. Matter is primary. Then there's a little miracle, and consciousness arises. And at the moment, there is no way of coping with this bridge. In fact, if you look at the brain and go down to the cellular level, do you find a mind anywhere? I had the pleasure of sitting next to Dan Dennett. Have you heard of Dan Dennett? A rabid materialist. Everything is brain. And I said to him, what about consciousness? Don't worry, he said. When we understand the neuron, there'll be nothing left to understand. That will explain everything. Well, I think he's a bit optimistic. So where is consciousness located? There is a very good theory, the OR theory, which argues that the microtubules of the brain may allow consciousness into the brain. And it's a nice theory, and I like it, and it's Stuart Hameroff and Penrose, Sir Roger Penrose. But note what I said, it lets consciousness into the brain, so we haven't answered anything really. It's just another correlate of brain function. I like Mary Midgley. She is a prominent philosopher who died, unfortunately, about 10 years ago. And what she wrote, I think, is probably one of the best things. The real trouble with the mind-body problem suggests that there are two rival stuffs, mind and matter, competing to be seen as basic to the world. There are no two such separate stuffs. There is just a complex world containing complex creatures. But actually, our thoughts are quite as real as our coffee cups, and matter is every bit as obscure a concept as mind. And she's worked in this field the whole of her life. So I think probably that's a good summary. So this is the Mary Midgley one. Both are ways of looking at the world, matter and consciousness. Okay, so which is true? Can we use the near-death experience to find out? Anybody here not heard of the near-death experience? Good. Okay, I'll keep you in mind. The near-death experience has been around for a very long time. Plato described it, but it came to scientific notice when Raymond Moody, in his book Life After Life, described patients which he found having these experiences after cardiac arrest. He was a physician. And then he wrote another book, Reflections on Life After Life. Kenneth Ring, one of the founders, did Life at Death, and the Gallup poll guy did Adventures in Immortality, and he found out about near-death experiences in the population. Michael Sabom, this one actually is worth getting. It's Recollections of Death, a Medical Investigation, published in '82. It's a bit old now, but he says that when people leave their bodies at the beginning of the NDE and look back at the resuscitation process, there is a lot of veridical information. Veridical means it's true information, so they're describing what actually happens when their brains are not functioning. Now, this, of course, is a most wonderful trap to get into, but look at Michael Sabom's book. It's got nice data. Bruce Grayson in Virginia works in this area. There's a brilliant book written in 1994, The Truth and the Light. And that is a book after a TV program. Some of you may remember it, 87, on near-death experiences. And we got 200 letters, 2,000 letters from people. You all remember letters, these things you open. And so we got huge numbers of accounts, and I took 500 of those, sent out a questionnaire, standardized the data, and then we wrote this book. So it tells us a lot about near-death experiences. And this is the most comprehensive research review, and it's by Janice Holden, Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. If you're interested, I would get that one after ours, of course. There it is. And 75% of the people who wrote in were women. Does this mean that women are very spiritual creatures? No, it means you all write letters. 35% weren't on medication, so that removes that as a cause. 99% had not heard of near-death experience at the time they had it. So that removes that these are just copying people, etc. And you'll never get another sample like this because everybody's heard about it now. And what we found is this, and you have to bear this in mind. A quarter, it occurred during an illness, 21% during an operation, 15% during childbirth, 10% during an accident. If you make a severe suicide attempt, then you will get a near-death experience. But look at that other thing at the bottom, 20%. 20%, that's nearly a quarter, had it in other circumstances. And this is where the near-death experience morphs into what Steve will be talking to us about, transcendent experiences. And the one that we became interested in was this one, 9% in a heart attack, because the argument was if the brain's not working, you can't have a near-death experience if mind is brain only. So it became absolutely crucial to try and find out. And a colleague I'm working with called Sam Parnell, who's now moved to New York, he's been working on the AWARE study, and we're awaiting his results. What happens? This is for you. It starts off with peace and calm, then out-of-body experiences, which are again a good test, because if they can get true information of what's going on at the beginning of the NDE, then obviously it can't just be made in the brain. Tunnel experiences in half, light in 3/4, and a being of light in 1/3. And what they see is they go into the pastoral landscape, they meet dead relatives, they have a life review. Now, do remember those: landscape, meeting dead friends and relatives, and having a life review. They come to a barrier in 24%, that's 1/4, and they know if they'll cross it, that this will in fact lead to them dying. Now, do we know that this may or may not be the process of death? When I started out on this, there was no data really to help. 3/4 take a decision to return, and transformation. And this is, again, enormously important. Half transform themselves after the near-death experience. And so I will look at this more closely. They're called gifts. You become very spiritual. You may leave your wife because you're different. Some become telepathic. Other people are dangerous around computers because computers don't like them. And these are all sort of paranormal effects. So what are these gifts? But we'll come to that. Is it only in the cardiac arrest NDEs we know the brain is not functioning? So can the mind experience during the same time? This is our crucial question. So cardiac arrest NDEs, the account of veridical OBEs, Janice Holden's got 100 of those. Spiritual landscapes, dead relatives, cosmic consciousness, going through the void with stars and things. The certainty that they've died, but they didn't actually die. So can you say that this is a model of death? We learn much more from what the dying tell us happens as we die. So now you've got the idea of pastoral landscapes, dead relatives in the near-death experience. Is this part of death or not? And much more important, in near-death experiences, people get an expansion of consciousness. Do we get an expansion of consciousness when we die? And because we know little about the dying process, we do not realize how important it is. Okay, how many of you have written your wills? You're a good lot. Okay, how many of you have obtained for yourself an attorney? Yeah, that's better. It's better. Who will look after your affairs when you can't anymore. That's very good. How many of you have thought about what you'd like for your funeral? You're a remarkable group. So a lot of you have thought about it, which is really good. And it means that what I'm saying today will actually be quite interesting to you and important. Because you see, in our culture, we fear death and shut it up by not discussing it. When were you last at the party and said, hey, do you know I'm going to be buried in Scotland? I'm going to have a huge monument. Any of you talk about like that at your parties? No, of course you don't. You'd be mad to do it. But that's our culture. We still do not understand and have just started to study the subjective and spiritual process of dying. And there is a huge divide here between the medical profession, who want to get you better or keep you comfortable as you die, and the nurses who see the phenomena. Anybody here from hospices? Yeah. Is what I say correct? Yep. They all say yes, you see, so I know I'm on safe ground. There are very few studies of phenomena surrounding the time of death, very few. When I started, which was in '93, there were hardly any. I mean, you could be a world expert after just reading 2 or 3 scientific papers. The literature was as bad as that. There is uncertainty about whether such phenomena are spiritual or organic in origin, but quite honestly, does it matter? Point is they're there, so we need to know about them. Many carers feel that they lack training in how to respond when told about these phenomena, right? Any of you been taught about these phenomena? Beginning to be now, but when you went in, I bet you weren't. So what are these phenomena? I'm going to give you a picture here, which suggests that they start with premonitions, okay? Then about a fortnight before death, deathbed visions. Then just before death, you go into a new reality. What's that like? Then you get chopped. And deathbed coincidences at the time of death, when you go and see somebody, you visit them. Some of you may have heard of accounts of these, because that's actually quite common. Terminal lucidity I won't go into. It's a powerful surge of energy just before you die. Clocks stop, animals, but they'll only stop if you like clocks. You've got to have an emotional content with them. Animals, of course, will howl. Bells will go off. Light always occurs when there is a huge change in consciousness. It goes with it. And shapes seen leaving the body. But are we going to really leave that guy there? I think he looks frightening. So let's take him away. I think that's much better. What about this one? I think that's much better. And that's the sort of image I'd like you to carry of what the death process is. So how well are our carers trained? Well, you've just heard that they don't have much training. Are they trained to recognize end-of-life experiences? This graph comes from our study. You will see the early English study is that one down there. This one is the Dutch study. So the Dutch are very well trained. So it's the English culture which doesn't train people. The Irish are appalling. And that's after we taught the English about them, and they were looking for them. So training is very important. So it's not really surprising that things weren't recognized. If you go into your hospice and talk about deathbed visitors to the medical staff, do they like it now? Good. That's a huge, huge step forward. So let's look at some recent work which is changing our view of dying. I'll just do these very quickly. This is a paper published by Wolian in 2016 there. And really what he says, the last hours of life are not easily explained within a traditional medical model. And that's the problem, because you've got to have a wider model. The most consistent caregivers are nurses who assess, recognize, and validate such experiences. So it's this divide between the carers and the medical profession. A nice book, if you like it, Alan Kelleher, professor of palliative care at Leeds. But I hear he's moving on. And so Alan Kelleher, 204. And he talks about dying from the dying point of view, which is what we want to know. And it's a good book because he ends up with saying we can also feel courage, love, hope, reminiscence, transcendence, transformation, and even happiness as we die. It's a very different picture. We, in fact, wrote that book, The Art of Dying, and that was after we got loads and loads of emails from people who sent us their experiences. And one of my co-workers wrote this pamphlet. It's downstairs for you, and it's free. If anybody wants them, I can send them to you. It's a brochure for relatives of the dying, and she wrote it when her father was dying. Well, the Dalai Lama has something to say about this. He says, if you've not practiced rituals, well, what are rituals? Rituals are, I think, just being aware of what the dying process is. And on your day, you're surrounded by sobbing friends and others involved in your affairs. Instead of having someone who reminds you of your virtuous practice, this will only bring trouble, and you'll have brought it on yourself. So he's arguing for us to learning about death, learning how we should behave in these last few moments of life. And it's caused, he says, by not being mindful of impermanence. Anybody in here not going to die? And this is the problem. Is this what happens in your hospices? I mean, how can you die with all that going on? Or would you rather be here? Is that how you want to die? Well, for heaven's sake, write something so that everybody knows you don't want to die like that. Awful. No, I want to die at home with all the grandchildren around. Yeah, much better. So let's examine the death process. And you get the diagnosis. It's terminal. You're going to die. And then you start the dying process. Some of you may actually have started it already because you're getting information and knowledge about it. But if you haven't, that's when you'll really start it. You're usually unprepared. True. People come to the hospice unprepared. For heaven's sake, what's wrong with our culture? Why don't people tell us about one of the major events of our life? The major event of our life. But what does it mean to be unprepared? Well, unfortunately, you will enter the dying process with feelings of fear, with feelings of anger and rejection, with feelings of loss, with feelings of sadness. But you should have feelings of curiosity. That's your word. That's why you have to remember it. You have to be curious about this whole process. You don't go off into being afraid of it. Just be curious. With feelings of acceptance, and very few, but now there's a whole group more, from a position of knowledge. You'll know something about it. And fortunately, there are now texts that you can look at. So to progress easily to death, and remember this, everything must be given up. And the shroud has no pockets. Sorry about that. You're not going to take anything with you that's physical. Your spiritual experience you may take with you, but nothing physical. Everything must be given up. And it's very, very difficult if you're not prepared for it. I was sitting on one patient's bed, and she was dying. We were talking about this, and she said, when she goes, but who's going to look after my little car? I mean, it's really, really sad. In actual fact, I don't think she's talking about her little car. I think she's probably talking about her daughter. But her daughter was 50 in New York and independent. I mean, she needs somebody just to help her through this phase. And of course, without understanding what the process is, you can't really do it. So end-of-life experiences, which I call ELLIes, give help in the final few weeks or days. And the thing about this is that you never die alone. Did you all copy that? You never die alone. You guys can tell me if I'm correct. I met a wonderful woman in Canada, and she runs one of the hospices there. And she says, in my hospice, nobody dies alone. And because she's in Canada, she has many people whose relatives just can't get there when people are dying. So you should say people do die alone, but not in her hospice. Because she says to them, who was the most important person in your life? Usually it's people's mums, sometimes it's friends, usually mums or a member of the family. What's her name? Mary. okay, when Mary comes, let me know. And so she'll go into the room and say, has Mary been yet? She'll say maybe yes or no. But if she says yes, she says, okay, next time Mary comes, go with her. And they die soon after. So they're looked after by these people. So this is important to know. We set out to find the nature of end-of-life experiences, and we interviewed the carers of the dying starting in 2003. 1 palliative care team, 2 English, 3 Dutch hospices, 1 nursing home, 1 Irish hospice. And we got, when I made this slide, over 1,000 emails, but in fact we got over 1,500, nearly 2,000 emails now, because people send me their experiences. So we got a lot of experiences. We interviewed doctors, nurses, auxiliary staff, chaplains, and volunteers. They're my lovely carers who did all the work. And Sue Brain, the top one, is the one who, whose dad was dying when she wrote the first draft of the pamphlet. Recent research, and do listen, because we're now coming into science, suggests that about 90% of those dying conscious will have end-of-life experiences. They're not that rare. So you guys have got to ask, who'd you see? Things like that. And do note this, an expansion of consciousness. Look, that guy must be mad. He's saying that we expand consciousness when we die. Well, that's what the data says. It's not what I say, it's what the data says. And we'll go into this. So let's start with deathbed visions. I joined my daughter after an hour at the hospital, and we both sat chatting to my mother. She spoke to me about my life and my future, all interspersed with references to these people who are now at the end of her bed. She told us that she wouldn't be there the next day, as these people would pick her up, just what this Canadian woman said, when she fell, and take her on a journey. We were slightly spooked at her comments, but she's totally at ease. They're very comforting. Our carers had found between 60 and 90%, again led by the Dutch, who are in red. And the deathbed visitors often sit on the bed. Why do they sit on the bed? All of you who have children will know perfectly well why they sit on the bed. Because when your kid's ill, what do? Sit on the bed, hold their hands. It's very comforting. And the deathbed visitors do exactly the same. And 60% of carers had heard stories about this. Who are the visitors? Well, in order to find this out, we took 118 deathbed visions and looked at who came, etc., and why. Well, a quarter were parents, so your mum and dad are quite common. Then persons unknown, and these are spiritual people, 17%. Anybody here not want their parents to come? Well, I expect they won't then. I mean, it's as simple as that. But reconciliation is enormously important. You may reconcile your relationship with them, even though they've died before you die. Greetings, joyful response, like that, no words. Other relatives, 14, and so on, down through the chain. Angels, 3%. Bad luck. If you want angels, go to the Bible Belt of America. There are hundreds of angels there. And I've talked to John Lerma, who's in a hospice there, and we were looking at their end-of-life experience. And angels are very common. But do you see the interaction of culture and what actually happens? Friends, only about 3%. Now, what about dogs and cats? Will your cat meet you? Will your dog meet you? Who'd like to be met by their dog? Yeah. And your cat? Yeah. Well, you won't be. I'm sorry about that. In only one account have I heard of all the dogs of my life came bounding to see me. So it does occur, but it's rare. This guy says, I thought it was going to be my mum. And he's right. So who sees the deathbed visitors? The dying. Rarely others in the room, especially children. Anybody from a hospice seen a deathbed visitor when they came? Okay, they are there. Now you're aware they're there. You may actually see them. And kids see them, and very rarely hospice or hospital staff. How do they come? Well, often come into the room shortly before death. 2 weeks is probably the maximum. Otherwise, a week is quite common. Will stand around or sit on the deathbed in the room, appear to be in real space as the dying direct their gaze and comments to a particular place. They talk to people and they're there. They know where they are. Maybe more than one person. Occasionally, unknown people wake at a distance, then come closer as death approaches. So we've had stories of all of those. So why do they come? You have to look at death differently. If really 90% of conscious people get end-of-life experiences, then you must ask why these dead people are there. And they say they come to greet them, to reassure them that they will be with them, to tell them when it's time to go, to take them on a journey, and they can be negotiated with, and the time of death delayed for a short while. In other words, if you want to go to the hospice party, they'll come before that. But if you really are waiting for somebody, then they will let you wait. Here's a delaying tactics. My sister heard Dad talking very crossly to someone in his room, fearing that one of his children had got in and upset him. She went in to see what was going on. Only Dad was there in his bed. My sister asked him who he was talking to, and he replied, "I was telling the angels that I was not ready to go yet." And he knew I was coming, and he was determined to stay alive until I had seen him. Now that actually is rather important to know when you're going into the dying process. You can delay it until people who you want come. Now we come on to another phase, moving to this new reality. What is it? And what do the dying say about it? You can see that it occurs just before death. You see, we've had Ellies all in this period here. We're now coming up to death, so it's around that period there. And wrong one. And the thing about it is that they go into this new reality. And the thing about this new reality is, do you see how I've taken that guy away? And I've replaced it with something quite different. And I've replaced it with something called non-dual consciousness. Call it cosmic consciousness. Sorry, I dropped my voice. Can you still hear at the back? Cosmic consciousness. In other words, it's a very wide level of consciousness. And Steve is going to tell us all about this. But there is evidence that we, in fact, go into that very wide state of consciousness before we die. Note that I've left light on the picture, because light is very common. Any of you seen light when people die? There you are. We've been validated. And this is the transformation of consciousness at the time of death. So we're not talking about a switching off, we're talking about a transformation. So it's very important. So you don't go into death anymore saying, "Oh my God, I'm going to be wiped out." Yes, you will be, but in the process you'll transform your consciousness. I learnt about this when I was in Jamaica. I was sitting on the beach eating lobster. And next to me was a mother whose daughter had just died. And she told me this story, that in the last 2 to 3 days, she was conscious of a dark roof over her head and a bright light. There's the light again. She moved into a waiting place where beings were talking to her, there to help her. Everything will be okay. loving beings, not a dream, and her grandfather was amongst them. And she moved in and out of this area. So you can see a preparation for what is coming. And there are lots of stories. My father was at my grandfather's bedside, deeply distressed. But my grandfather quietly said to my father, "Don't worry, Leslie, I'm all right. I can see and hear the most beautiful things, and you must not worry." And he quietly died, lucid to the end. So it's a different sort of picture. Not in every case, some cases. The point is it's there. And you can see that the Dutch are best at getting stories about this. The Irish are still worse. British in between. It's about 50% of the carers have heard stories of that type. So what I want to do, in fact, is to go on with this and look much more at the characteristics of this dual consciousness. And remember that the transformation of consciousness is the process of death. This is what you're doing. We'll hear more about how you're going to do it successfully. So, it's experienced by 90% of the dying. That's where that figure comes from. Very like the NDE world. That's why it's interesting to know what the NDE world is. Love, light, and compassion, wholeness and feelings of unity, waiting area with spiritual beings and dead relatives are present. Now, if I'd read that out as a near-death experience, you'd be almost happy. 90% of people with an NDE don't get it, but enough do for you to see similarities to it. But do remember, please, that there are different levels of NDEs, and this is the commonest one. A response, this is a guy whose partner was dying of AIDS at home in 1991, before they had drugs, of course. "I spent the last week lying beside him at home much of the time, and on one or two occasions a look of sheer ecstasy lit up his face as he smiled and looked at something I couldn't see." What's this guy doing, going into ecstasy just before he dies? And they're real questions. I mean, fascinating questions. And one of the best papers that I know of is Fear, Pain, Denial, and Spiritual Experience in the Dying Process, and it's by somebody called Monica Rentz. Have you read Monica Rentz's papers? And her book, yeah. There's some of her books downstairs. She is a palliative care theologian, and she works in Switzerland. And she's not loved by her colleagues because she has examined death and has a slightly different view from the switching off one. And we'll go into what Monica has to say. And if any of you want her paper, then that's my email address. You don't have to write anything on it and say, "Hey, Peter, that was a brilliant talk." Or you can say, "Hey, Peter, I don't agree with a word that you said," but you don't have to do anything like that. Just put Monica Rentz in the subject of the email and I'll send you the papers, okay? So you can get hold of her papers very easily and see what you make of her data. Monica Rentz says, "Spirituality includes more than just giving a response," and this really is for anybody who deals with the dying. "Giving a response to a patient's spiritual attitude. Spiritual needs as well as patient's consciousness and communications are changing. They're changing during the dying process. Spirituality has to do with altered connectedness and consciousness. So when you go into this dying process, your consciousness is going to change. Let's have a look at more data. Spiritual experiences are powerfully independent of religious attitudes. Isn't that interesting? And a strong religious attitude, in my view, is a materialist view of the world. Just brain. And people who go into dying knowing that this is the end, everything's going to finish, etc. Rubbish. And they find that it's not like that. And I got some nice experiences of people who thought that was going to happen. This is Monica Renz's book, The Transitions. I have some of them downstairs, which they were given to me by Monica Renz, and I'm charging you guys £5 so that the £5 can go to the Arthur Rank Hospice. And she talks about 3 phases in dying, and I like using her model because I think it's a good one. Pre-transition, transition, and post-transition. And this particular paper of hers was an 80-patient series. Now, just look at the quality and depth of this study. There were a lot of them involved. They had at least 3 observations a day. So you're going into your hospice and you're asking your patients a questionnaire 3 times a day. That's heavy, very heavy. And the questionnaire is fear, pain, denial, and spiritual experiences. Those were her dimensions. And from those observations, she determined the transition level. And remember what they were, pre-transition and post. And so we're going to look at that. So remember, the process of dying is an expansion of consciousness. It's not a contraction. That's what the data shows anyway. And remember that this is a new concept. Your mates won't like it. They'll, just imagine, guys, I'm going to be cosmic when I die. Lock him up. But in fact, look at the data and see actually what it means. So let's look at pre-transition, Monica Renz. Patients may feel needs. Remember, you're in the hospice, you're dying, you're in pre-transition. And what you're doing is clearing and cleaning, giving up your attachments. Remember the shroud having no pockets? You've got to give up your attachments. When you're lying there in the bed being looked after by these wonderful people, give up all your attachments, all of them. If you don't, you will in fact go into terminal anxiety. And many hospices give midazolam for terminal anxiety. I'm going to suggest that this may not be the right treatment. Proper treatment may be that they are entering the dying process, realizing that dying is inevitable, and what they want is you to be nice to them and help them with the problems they've got, rather than just wiping out their consciousness. So blocks to transition or terminal anxiety, they can be locked in pre-transition due to denial. I'm not dying. Expect you find that quite often. You get better. Reactivated traumas. Oh God, I remember when I was so awful. Strong attachments. Who's going to look after my little car? You know, kids and so on. And unresolved family issues. Now, resolution at the time you're dying is much easier because of the quality and nature of what's in the room with a dying person. And so you get a much better understanding of the conflicts, and resolution comes out of it. And so awareness of previous negative behavior may hold you there as well. So to help them through this period, support and release from attachments helps them to move on. So you've all got to clean. You've all got to clean. Sorry about it, guys, but you've all got to clean. You've got to give up everything. Everything. Go back home, lie on your bed and say, I've got to give up everything. And see how long you manage it. But when you really have to, then you have to. Okay, then you move on to the next phase if you do that one successfully. And the fact that 90% of people do seem to do it successfully, the chances are you'll be okay. It implies the loosening of ego consciousness. What's ego consciousness? That is your sense of I. So your sense of I begins to go. You're not held so rigorously in your present state. Patients typically show physical signs of anxiety and struggle if they're not clean. Some patients simply stare and are restless, and you can, at this stage, reactivate all traumas, but it's just the stage you're going through. The cleaner you are, the shorter time you'll spend in transition. And then you go to post-transition, and do listen to this. The ego is not dominant anymore. Your level of consciousness has changed. You're in what's called non-symbolic or non-dual consciousness. You become part of the universe, and I'll explain that to you too. Patients seem to be serene, in a state of being beyond anxiety, pain, or powerlessness. This really isn't our concept of death at all, but it does seem to be correct. Many are unable to speak, but can still hear, often communicate by gestures or single words. And so, of course, one of my questions to Monica was, how do you know this? How do you know when people are so close to death? And so she says, she asks them, and a lot of them will just go, ah. In other words, it's a validation of the state that they are experiencing. Really interesting. Sometimes reconciliation, visions, and peace are observed. And such transformative experiences may be compared to a spiritual awakening or completion of the journey. That's Monica. So the spiritual awakening is what it's about. So you guys are going to change when you die. And that's okay. So here's one of her patients. I like this one. Here they are in pre-transition, cleaning, nearly there, cleaning. Then they go into transition, and then they change level of consciousness and die. Okay? But do see the cleaning process, and have a look at this one. If you actually think about it, this guy was very nearly there. These are days, incidentally, and these are levels, obviously. He was very, very nearly there and got into the post-transition state very quickly. Went back to transition in post-transition. Obviously had a few things that needed to be given up, then came back again and was in that state before he died. So it's not going to all be like the first one. You'll go up and down, and the better you've done your cleaning, the more likely you are to have a smooth effect at the end. But how are you guys going to do this if nobody tells you? Don't know. It's a puzzle, isn't it? I like this one. And I like this one very much. And you'll see again why we started with NDEs. Do you see the yellow-colored columns? That's minimal or little suffering. And do you see the blue columns? That's a lot of suffering. So you don't want to be in the blue columns, you want to be in the yellow columns. And have a look at these. That column is mystical spiritual experiences. So people who have experienced this state before, you would expect them not to have a lot of suffering, and they don't. Or what about this one? That one there, oh, sorry. That one there is, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button. There. That one is, I like to meditate. It's quieting the mind, so you're coming to understand your mind. So a little bit of meditation is good. Or this one, do you want to be in the 89%? It's a near-death experience. These people have all been there before. Now, there's no reason why. They all say they're not afraid of death, but what does that mean? What have they experienced? And many of the near-death experience people have, in fact, experienced altered consciousness. And so when they come back, and I've met some of these people, because I was giving a lecture, and I was wanting to, there were NDE people there, and I was asking them, how many of you, not in so many words, are in an altered state of consciousness? Come up and see me after. And this lovely woman came up, she'd had an NDE, she'd flipped her level of consciousness into non-symbolic consciousness. And she's absolutely ready to die. I mean, she knew all about it. So that's why I think near death is important. Oh, no, sorry. missed one very important one. How could I have missed it? Look at that one there. You can't read the text. I can. I'm curious. I'm curious. I'm curious about the afterlife. So all of you must go and remember that word. And you two failed. So I'm curious. It's important. And go into your dying process just being curious. Okay. She's published another paper, and I'm not going to go into this in any depth, but I can let you have a copy of it. It's the forgiveness and reconciliation process. And remember, this is part of the cleaning process and what happens. It goes through 5 phases: denial, crisis, experiences of hope, and decision. Denial and crisis, of course, Kubler-Ross. Experience of hope, well, I'm not actually dying, is one. Decisions and forgiveness, and so on. So she's got a whole series now of what helps, and mediation. Neutral parties help support patients in finding forgiveness and reconciliation. And so as caregivers, we need to consider which therapy, which intervention, which encouraging words would increase this particular patient's hope. Okay, so it's got a very strong message for all of us in palliative care. Here you are. Suddenly she stared intently up at the window. This lasted only minutes, but it seemed ages. She suddenly turned to me and said, "Please, Pauline, don't ever be afraid of dying. I've seen a beautiful light and I was going towards it." Light again. Interesting, isn't it? I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful. Could have been a near-death experience. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful. I really had to fight to come back. Sadly, she died the next day. But I knew that she had seen something that day which gave her comfort and peace. So it's all there in the accounts of the dying. I was nursing my friend who had definite views that there was no afterlife. Okay. In her last couple of hours, she became very peaceful and arose from her unconsciousness periodically, saying clearly and happily such phrases as "I will know soon," so she's obviously being led. "Come on, get on with it then." So she's still got a bit of ego. "I'm ready to go now," and it's so beautiful. So it actually doesn't matter whether you believe it's going to be there or not, it comes. But you get a much smoother passage if you go through the preparation for it. She is very obviously content, happy, and at peace. So you should be able to die where you want. Home is where I want to die. Specialized spiritual units, we don't really have them yet, do we? We're moving a little bit more in that direction. Hospices will turn into special spiritual units, I hope, in the future. And special spiritual hospital units, and that's very important because people who are dying and going to die in hospital, you don't want to be moved out, you just be moved into the special unit for people who are dying, but it's a special spiritual hospital unit. Are there such really wonderful hospices? Well, yes, there's the Arthur Rank, obviously. But when we did the Dutch part of our study, I found such a hospice, and I'd love to have died there. That doesn't quite make sense. You know what I mean. And it's a small hospice called De Vogel, 4 birds, staffed by 2 wonderful nurses, and they are absolutely fantastic. They have a lot of volunteers, but they're the medical staff. Simone de Kuyper and Suzanne von Westerbrugger, wonderful people, and they look after this hospice. They confirm the phenomena we've been talking about today regularly occur in their hospice. It's there. And they describe a strong emotional pulse of love felt in the room of the dying. Does that figure? Come on, guys. We need to get up to speed, don't we? It's all there. And in that hospice, the Tibetan chimes are struck to celebrate a passing. It's very nice. And they give you a candle, which is lit with 3 birds and 1 bird flying away. And it's a thick candle, so you keep it alight until the funeral. So it's a nice way of continuing the process. Now, I'm going to tell you about an old friend of mine, Paul Robertson, head of the Medici Quartet. Mean anything? Yeah, really talented violin player. And he had an NDE, so we're linking now NDE and dying together. There he is, an astonishing man. You should read his book sometime. And Paul had a near-death experience. He was under general anesthetic, non-conscious. His heart was stopped and his head cooled to prepare his brain for a period of brain starvation, just where you get an NDE. In his book, Paul describes very clearly what he experienced while in this deeply unconscious state. This doesn't make sense, does it? He hasn't got a brain, so how can he experience anything? We're talking NDEs. When he was between life and death. He was, he says, fully aware that he was dying and moving from this state to the experience of potential unification of his consciousness with that of the universe. This could just be out of Monica Rentz's paper. I mean, it's astonishing. As I lay there waiting, I felt myself die. And do listen to this. As I lay there waiting, I felt myself die beautifully, ecstatically, transcendentally. I saw eternity and shed the whole of my life joyfully in order to become unified with it. Okay? Do you get it? It's very wide, isn't it? And that's what he felt. So why did he come back? You know, he's got the whole of the cosmos. Why come back? And because his family pulled him back. And you've probably seen this too. They all say, Dad, don't go, do stay here. They played Paul his CDs and so on, anything to get him back, and he came back. But I'm pleased he did, because he and I discussed the whole process of dying and the changes in consciousness at that time. So I was fully aware of what he felt and what he thought was going to happen. And so in his final vision, when he actually died 2 years ago, his wife and family were with him and they were prepared and they let him go. And I wanted to be there too, because Paul agreed that I would be there so that I could get his last words. But I missed it by a day. But he died the next day, and his wife told me what happened. Paul woke up slightly from a deep sleep and told me, I must let Peter Fenwick know that, that there is nothing new. We've all been there before. What about that, guys? You can't get anything closer than that. So the final transition, this is what you're all going to go through. It's the crumbling of the ego. Remember to clean yourselves and clean yourselves. Drop all your attachment, that means. Subject-object consciousness transforms what we're in now, subject-object, into non-symbolic consciousness, and all is a divine unity. So that's what the data says. And remember what Paul says, as I lay there waiting, I felt myself die beautifully, ecstatically, transcendentally. I saw eternity and shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. So there's a lot of joy around at that time. It would seem that we were never born and we'll never die. Can't die, because you'll go into this state. So what are you afraid of, guys? Anybody afraid of dying? Well, don't say yes. Steve will talk about these, but it's just interesting. This was a transcendent experience which I had after a silent retreat. You get them after retreats, and this was at the Brahma Kumaris, and it's very much like the dying process in many ways. There was no difference between me and the divine light, love and light. Consciousness steamed through me, and that is what creation is. No me, no looking, wanting, discussing, all entirely false, because I don't exist, never did, just the endless flow of the divine. Constructs the moment, is the moment, and when it ceases to manifest, it then returns to the unmanifest. So it's all there for you. Go on a 5-day retreat, and then you can learn what it's going to be like when you die. Incidentally, this is nothing special. We can all do it. So non-dual experiences arise as we die and become part of the cosmos. Non-dual experiences arise in some people who have had an NDE. That is why I think they don't have any difficulty in dying, because they've already experienced the state. So, thank you all very much.